In today's workshop, we're going to talk about the most precious resource in the world, which is time. We're going to talk about time measurements and how a culture in fantasy or sci-fi might divide their day up into smaller bits. We're also going to talk about how the year is divided up and what makes year one, what happened at the beginning of time. As usual, these are just my opinions, my techniques, my questions that I ask when I do these things. They are not in any way all-encompassing, and there might be other versions of this out there that will work better for you. And I'm going to stop saying this at the beginning of every video because I feel like it takes time away from the actually interesting stuff, and it should be obvious that what I'm talking about is just what works for me and not necessarily what works for you. So this is the last time I'm going to say that. So let's get into the interesting stuff, shall we? So I'm going to start here. I'm going to start with the length of the year, which is going to be a boring answer because I'm going to make this planet revolve around its sun and around its own axis roughly, or actually exactly the same way that Earth does, because I don't want to change the length of the year. And the reason I don't want to do that is because while it's a lot of fun, world-building wise, for readers, it is confusing. It can be very, very confusing to change the length of the year. Depending on how important the length of the year is to your story, but then again, if it's not important to your story, maybe there is no point in spending time in changing it up, but that's just me. So the length of the year is 365 days. Whether or not it has a leap year or things like that, that's probably irrelevant, so who cares about that? The next question is, how is the year divided? And I've already said that it's 365 days, so it has days, and I'm gonna not bother with weeks for now, but it has months, and it probably has seasons as well if you're in part of the world where there are, distinct seasons. And then the next question is going to be, what are the terms for the parts of the year? And things are going to get a lot more interesting further on in this workshop. I am doing this really quick because it isn't particularly interesting, because I am going to call things, I'm going to call them days, and I'm going to call them months. Yeah, I'm going to call them months. Again, sometimes I do moons or moon cycle instead, but the point is, because the next question is why? What does it mean that I'm using these words? The fact that I'm using the word month, or even if I'd been using the word moon, means that they divide the year up depending on the cycle of the moon. Again, this is common in our world. That is, I'm not going to say that all calendars in the world are based on that, but many calendars of the world are based somewhat around the moon. And I'm going to make it the same way here, because this world has one moon, it has the same kind of phases as our world, so why wouldn't they put some significance into that? Basically. And then now the next thing I'm going to do, this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. It is not just 12 months. Because if you look at the moon cycles of our world, there are 13 cycles to the moon every year and not 12, more or less. So this is something I'm going to use. I'm going to make it 13 months. So there are 13 months, and they are of course not going to be called, January, February, March, April, and so on, because A, I would have to make up a 13th month, and B, we call months that because of our culture, and this culture is going to be different from ours. It's not going to have had the same languages and the same ways of naming things or anything like that. The exact names for the months I might have to get back to in the names and language episode, or I will just take a page out of the Japanese book and just call them the number of the month. So month number 1, month number 2, month number 3, and so on. I did that in my other fantasy world, and I'm actually going to do it here too, because I'm not going to have time to get back to all of the naming things that I have said that I'm going to get back to in my naming and language episodes. So yes, the months are just month 1, 2, 3, and so on. And so then the next question I want to ask is, when does a new year start? When is month number 1? Now I'm just doing one culture in one dimension of my world, and that culture is going to celebrate the new year at midwinter, because like I said in my other episode on this, midwinter is a pretty reasonable time to celebrate a new year starting, because that is when things are going from dark and starting to go and get a bit lighter and warmer. Sort of. The coldest part of winter is generally after midwinter here, but never mind. We're talking about light now. So, midwinter. And I am going to make it midwinter because it has never made sense to me in our world why we celebrate Christmas and New Year's so very close to each other, and yet none of them fall on midwinter. So, yeah, this culture is going to make a lot more sense, and they're going to celebrate midwinter as New Year's, and they'll just have fewer parties than we do, because fewer parties are good. I don't like parties. That's not entirely true. Anyway, this is how I'm going to do it for now. And as for the why does the New Year start there? Like I said, it's a logical place, and this also means, again, that this culture, this calendar of this culture is based around nature. They divide the year up into months because of the moon. They celebrate New Year's on the darkest day of the year, and that is based on nature as well. So this is a calendar that is based a lot around nature. It's based around nature, and like I said, based around light, because the moon cycle also means more or less light. When the moon is full, there is more light, and when the moon is invisible, there is no light during the night, except for the stars, but never mind them. So that might mean that light is very important for this particular culture, which would make sense because, again, this culture that I'm thinking about, I've already shown you on the map where it is, and it is in an area where days would fluctuate during the year. It's not so far south that, that midwinter is the sun never rises, but it's still to where the days are significantly shorter during the winter than they would be during the summer. And, light is important, because now I'm thinking that this is in the fantasy part of the world where they don't have a lot of artificial light, or they can't use artificial light to do all of the chores that they need to do. So when there is light and when there's dark will dictate how they live their lives. So with that, let's go to the next question, which is, when did this era start? I talked in my previous video about what makes such a big impact on your culture or your world that they decided, okay, this is where we start a new era. This is year 1 or year 0, however they want to count that. As examples, in the Western world, we go by the birth of Jesus. In Japan, I know that they do that too now, but they also have a separate way of counting eras that evolve when their emperors ascend the throne. So it's currently year 1 in that way of counting in Japan, because Emperor Naruhito ascended the throne less than a year ago now. So that is another example of what can impact a culture enough that they decide that this is when we start counting time. In this case, I am going to say that time started 62 years ago. And the answer to the question why is that 62 years ago is when they discovered the portal, or when the portal opened between the 2 dimensions of my world. I've mentioned it before, this is a world that has 2 dimensions, where one is a magical one and one doesn't have magic, but instead has technology. So 62 years ago, that portal was discovered or created. I'm not entirely sure which one, but either way, that is a pretty big thing. That is a thing that is going to impact the entire world, and so I think it makes sense that that's when they decided that, okay, the previous era, whatever that was, that ended now, and we're starting a new one. And of course, not every single culture is going to adhere to this. This is probably the global one in the technological world, because I think that is a more globalized world than the magical one. That is, of course, going to depend on, what kind of magic they have in this world. I'm getting to that topic in couple of videos from now. I don't remember quite when I've planned that, but it's pretty soon. But still, there are probably cultures in both dimensions that are not using this 62. They might when they're dealing with other countries because it's sort of universal, but they might also have their own way of counting, a little bit like Japan, that is based on something that their culture values more than this portal opening or being found. And now we're getting to the next question, which is a really fun one, which is, how was the day divided? And I'm going to be somewhat boring here again and say that there are 24 hours and 60 minutes to an hour and 60 seconds to a minute and all that, because that is just the easiest way to do things, again, partially for the purpose of this workshop and partially for the purpose of when I actually write something, if I actually write something in this world. It is so much easier to have the day being divided into similar length chunks as we are used to. And also for the purpose of this workshop, I am not interested in doing the math right now in how I could divide things differently. So this is partially just me being, lazy. So that's sort of the answer to the question why. I'm lazy. Also, for some reason, again, I don't know why, but we decided that this was a good way of measuring time, and I'm sure cultures in this world also decided that that was a good way of measuring time. It has to do with, degrees and circles and 360 degrees and yeah, let's go with that. But now let's do something fun with the terms for the parts of the day, because I am not going to call them hours and minutes and seconds because, yeah, again, I mentioned this in the previous video, that usually I do call them hours and minutes and seconds and all of that, but I also think it's a lot of fun to play with terms, but you do have to be careful if you're playing with terms. I used drop and stitch as examples in my last video, and they mean other things. A drop also means a drop, and if it also means a second, you need to make that very, very, very clear when they start using that as a measurement for time. But I am going to do something fun, and I have not planned this out, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a book from my bookshelf, and I'm going to get a random word, and we're going to see if I can turn that into a time measurement. And yeah, let's see if this works. So let's do this. I have grabbed How To by Randall Munroe. It's a non-fiction book. It's a really fun book. If you don't know who Randall Munroe is, he does the webcomic XKCD, and it's really funny. And yeah, either way, I am opening this book to a random page, and I am taking a pen, and I'm just gonna do that. I'm not pointing to a word. Okay. Still not pointing to a word. I'm gonna find a page that has more words on it, because there's a lot of images and stuff. This has a lot of words on it. Let's try that. Okay. I ended up, I think, I'm cheating a little bit, because the word which, as in which thing is what, which thing is which, yeah, whatever, is going to be difficult. But I do have the word peaked, which I am going to change to peak. So a peak is a time measurement. And now let's try to figure out what the word peak signifies. So the first thing I'm going to do with this is I'm going to Google synonyms and definitions for peak, thesaurus.com. I'm sure that's good. So we have crest, hill, mountain, pinnacle, roof, spike, summit. Privacy, yes, we accept cookies. I accept cookies. Cookies are good. There's also alp, apex, brow, cope, tip, point. Let's see. Noun for maximum and zenith. We have height, pinnacle, summit, top. Same sort of, and as a verb, climax, crest, culminate. Okay, so basically we have what I thought when I first saw this word as well, which is it has something to do with mountains. The peak of a mountain. So peak is then something tall, something high up. So I'm going to say that that is an hour. An hour is a peak. And I wonder if it is, I think it is a noun. A peak has gone by, 2 peaks have gone by. Could also be a verb. Sorry, my computer did something stupid. It's still doing something stupid. Sorry, some computer issues. What was I saying? I was saying that a peak, it could also be a verb. We have peaked. We have peaked once. We have peaked 4 times since that happened. Interesting. So next question is then, what are smaller versions of peak for a minute and second? It doesn't have to be smaller versions either. It can just be something that comes from the same place. I don't know, the opposite of peak would be a valley, I suppose. If it goes like peak, plain, valley. But that's a bit far-fetched, I think. I don't think that's going to work. Okay, so then what I should consider instead is the kind of culture that this might have come from. I do have my dwarves, which live in mountains, but they live in mountains and not on mountains. So peak doesn't really work for that. Okay, so what if it's not a noun? What if I use it as a verb instead? To peak. In order to peak, you have to climb, you have to get better at something, you have to, I don't know, you have to rise. It's the top of something, you have to climb or ascend, you have to rise, get better, practice something. Probably missing something obvious here. Okay, but if you have to climb something, then in order to reach the peak, you have to climb, you have to take some steps. So what if we call something a step? A second, you have to take steps in order to ascend, in order to reach the peak. What would then be between a step and the peak? I'm not a mountain climber. If I was that, I probably would have some sort of term I could use. Reach? Like not, you reach the peak, but as in you reach for something. Because if you're climbing, you're taking steps with your feet, you're reaching things with your hands in order to pull yourself up, and eventually you reach the peak. A thing I could do as well, which I might actually do here, because I'm not really happy with reach. So they might not have minutes. They have steps, which is a second, which is the amount of time it takes to complete a step. And it has hour, which is a certain amount of steps that you need to do to reach a peak. Maybe it's a specific peak that this culture puts significance to. So maybe it's not a whole mountain, maybe it's just the peak of a hill. In which case maybe it takes, oh, do I have to do the math now? How many seconds are in an hour? 86,400? Does that make sense? Did I math correctly? So maybe whatever peak this is takes 86,400 steps, roughly, probably, to climb. Yeah, let's say that. We have peak and step. We don't have a word for minute. Maybe we have words for like half hour or a quarter of an hour, quarter of a peak, half a peak, plateau. Maybe there's a plateau halfway up this hill. So half hour is a plateau. And then those are the measurements they have. They don't have, 10 minutes. They say the peak is an hour, plateau is half an hour, and then you've got like halfway to the plateau is a quarter of an hour, and they've figured out a way to say that as a time measurement instead. Let's go with that. I'm not going to go deeper into that right now, but this means that we have a culture that puts some sort of significance into this peak, this specific place, and it's probably a religious thing. I'm not going to go into what exactly it could signify in the religion. I am going to do episodes on religion as well, so maybe I'll get back to that there. But either way, this is one way of figuring out the terms and learning something about your culture in the process. This culture has a hill that is significant to them, and whatever that means for the culture, who knows? Maybe I'll get into that in a later episode as well. I hope this video has given you some insights into how you can work with time to make your world building deeper. In the next world building video from me, we are going to continue on the time path, and we're going to talk about history. So if you're interested in that, don't forget to subscribe and hit the little bell so you get a notification when that video comes up. Also hit the like button if you like this video, and I will see you in the next one.